The Duke held the painted portrait above his head where the whole ballroom could see it, and then he tore it down the center, straight through the face of the woman who had painted it. "A scullery girl who fancies herself an artist," he said, and the canvas screamed as it split. 600 candles burned in the gallery of Aldenmore Palace, and not one of them flickered when Seraphine Voss lifted her chin and refused to cry. She did not reach for the ruined halves of her work. She did not beg. She stood at the foot of the marble stair in a borrowed gray dress 2 sizes too large, her hands clasped at her waist, and she watched Duke Aldrich Thornvale tear her in half in front of 300 guests as though she were a bill he had decided not to pay. The orchestra had stopped. A footman froze mid-step with a tray of crystal. Somewhere above, in the high windows, a single black raven beat its wings against the glass and could not get in. "Look at her," called Lady Ophelia Marchwood from the second tier, her diamonds catching the light. She thought the Duke might keep it. Frame it, perhaps, hang it in his bedchamber. The laughter that followed her was the cruel, practiced kind, the laughter of people who have never once been hungry. Seraphine had painted that portrait over 4 months by stolen candle stub light. It was the Duke as she had seen him only once, unguarded, asleep in his study, with grief loosening his hard mouth. She had given it to him as a gift. He had unwrapped it on the gallery floor, and now its 2 halves lay at his polished boots. "Pick it up," the Duke said. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. "Pick up your little tribute, girl, and take it to the kitchens where it belongs." His storm-gray eyes did not soften by a degree. The old scar through his left eyebrow lifted as he looked down at her from his full height, and the whole bright room leaned in to watch the scullery painter crawl. Seraphine did not crawl. She crouched, slow and unhurried, and she gathered the 2 pieces of the canvas. Her fingers found the torn edge where his painted face had been ripped from his painted heart, and she pressed the halves together as if she could mend them with the press of her thumbs. Then she stood, holding the ruined portrait against her chest, and she looked the Duke of Thornvale full in the eye. "You tore the wrong half," she said quietly. "The likeness is gone, but the man I painted is still in the room." A gasp moved through the gallery like wind through dry wheat. No one spoke to the Duke that way. No one with a name spoke to him that way, let alone a girl who scrubbed his pots. Lady Ophelia's smile curdled. On the dais at the top of the stair, an old woman in black velvet, who had not moved all evening, turned her silver head 1 slow degree, and for the first time that night the Dowager Duchess of Aldenmore looked at the scullery girl as though she had seen a ghost. The Duke's jaw tightened. "Remove her," he said to the steward. "She is dismissed from this house tonight." 2 liveried men started forward. The crowd parted to let them pass, hungry for the rest of it, the dragging out, the tears that surely had to come now. Seraphine clutched the broken portrait and did not step back, and for 1 heartbeat her green eyes met the Duke's gray ones, and something flickered in him that the room could not see, a recognition he could not name, a discomfort he would spend the next 3 weeks failing to outrun. "Stop." The single word came from the dais, thin and dry and absolute. The Dowager Duchess rose from her chair. She was 80 if she was a day, her spine straight as a fire iron, a black lace fan trembling in her ringed hand. The 2 footmen halted. The Duke turned. "Grandmother," he said, "this does not concern you." The girl forgets her place. The old woman descended the marble stair 1 careful step at a time, and the whole gallery held its breath, because the Dowager of Aldenmore had not left her rooms for a public ball in 11 years. She crossed the floor. She stopped in front of Seraphine, and she lifted 1 trembling hand to the girl's throat, where a thin chain hung, and she drew out from beneath the gray collar a small tarnished pendant shaped like a falcon mid-stoop. The Dowager went white. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "It was my mother's," Seraphine said. "It is the only thing I have of her. I was left at the Sisters of St. Bridget with it round my neck." The old woman's fan dropped from her fingers and clattered on the marble. 300 people watched the most powerful dowager in the kingdom sway on her feet and catch herself on the arm of the very scullery girl her grandson had just thrown out. "Aldrich," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the silent gallery, "put down whatever you are about to say. This falcon was struck for one woman in the history of this realm. It was buried with the lost Princess Aurelia of the House of Vossard 19 years ago." She turned the pendant over with a shaking thumb, and on the back, worn but legible, were 3 engraved words. "Except," the Dowager said, "the Princess Aurelia was never found. Only this empty grave, and a missing infant daughter." She looked up into Seraphine's bewildered face, and tears stood in the old woman's hard eyes. "Child, you have your grandmother's chin, you have the Vossard falcon, and you have just been called a scullery girl in my house by a duke who is not fit to carry your train." The portrait slipped from Seraphine's arms and fell, the 2 torn halves landing face up on the floor between her and the duke. Aldrich Thornvale looked down at the ruined painting of himself, and then he looked at the girl he had torn it for, and the color drained from his face like wine from a cracked glass. He went down on one knee. 300 guests saw the Duke of Thornvale kneel to the scullery girl, and not one of them ever forgot it. But to understand why a man like Aldrich would kneel, and what it would cost both of them before the night was through, you have to go back 4 months, to the morning a half-drowned girl with a falcon round her neck first walked through the servants' gate of Aldenmore Palace and asked, in a voice too fine for her rags, whether they had work for a pair of clever hands. The night Seraphine's portrait fell is only where it begins. To understand the falcon at her throat, the murderer who was already on his way to Aldenmore, and why the coldest man in the kingdom would never be the same after the canvas split, we have to go back to the rain. 4 months earlier, the rain had come sideways off the moor, and Seraphine Voss had walked 11 miles in it with everything she owned tied in a square of oilcloth. The Sisters of St. Bridget had kept her until she was 23 and then, with apologies and a loaf of bread, had sent her into the world. Because a charity orphanage cannot keep a grown woman forever. She had 2 skills. She could grind pigment and stretch canvas and lay down a likeness that made grown men weep, a gift the nuns had never been able to explain in a foundling, and she could scrub a floor until it shone. The first skill fed no one. So she presented the second at the servants' gate of the largest house on the moor. The housekeeper, a flint-faced woman named Mrs. Good, looked her up and down and saw a soaked girl with chapped hands and a strange, straight way of holding her head. "We've no need of more mouths," Mrs. Good said. Then a pot crashed in the scullery beyond, and a string of curses followed it, and the housekeeper sighed. "Cook's lost her 3rd girl this month. Hands that don't quit." "Can you do that?" Seraphine said she could. She did not mention the falcon round her neck, because she had learned young that an orphan with a pretty trinket is an orphan who gets it stolen. The kitchens of Aldenmore were an underworld of steam and shouting and copper gone green at the seams. Seraphine scrubbed. She hauled. She learned the order of the bells that summoned the upstairs world she would never see. The long pull for the dining room, the double ring for the Duke's study, the frantic jangle that meant the Dowager wanted her tea and wanted it 5 minutes ago. She learned that the master of the house was a widower of 34 who had buried his wife 3 winters past and had not smiled since. The other servants spoke of Duke Aldrich the way they spoke of the weather, as a force you survived rather than a man you knew. "Cold as the cellar floor," said the kitchen boy, Tom Pell, a sharp-eyed lad of 12 who took to following Seraphine like a stray. "He sacked a groom last week for looking him in the eye. You keep your head down, miss, and your eyes on the pots." But Seraphine could not keep her eyes on the pots. She had a painter's affliction. She saw faces. And the first time she saw the Duke of Thornvale, really saw him, across the kitchen garden one gray dawn as he stood alone among the dead roses with a child's small glove in his hand, she did not see the tyrant the servants feared. She saw a man holding the only thing left of someone, and she saw, underneath the granite of his face, a grief so total it had simply frozen. She went back to her cot in the attic that night and, by the stub of a candle she was not supposed to have, she began to draw him on the back of a flour sack. It became a habit, then a hunger. She stole minutes the way other servants stole sugar. She traded a week of darning to old Bess, the laundress, for a cracked cake of watercolor a former lady's maid had left behind. She mixed lampblack with kitchen grease for her darks and crushed dried madder root for her reds. And in the cold attic, over 4 months of stolen candle ends, the Duke's face emerged on a stretched square of discarded sailcloth. Not the public mask, but the man in the garden with the small glove, the man no one else had bothered to look at. She was not the only one who watched the Duke, though. The Dowager Duchess watched too. From her high windows, from behind her black lace fan, from 11 years of self-imposed exile in the East Wing. And the Dowager, it would turn out, had been watching the servants' gate of Aldenmore for 19 years, ever since the night a midwife she trusted had carried a swaddled infant out of a burning manor and vanished into the rain. But that is the part of the story even Seraphine did not yet know. What Seraphine did know was hunger and cold, and the particular loneliness of a person who can make beautiful things in a world that has decided she is only good for scrubbing. So when the Duke's name-day ball was announced, the first entertainment Aldenmore had hosted since the late Duchess died, and when the whole house turned itself inside out, polishing silver and laying down rose petals, Seraphine made a decision that the sensible part of her knew was madness. She would give him the portrait. Not for money. Not for advancement. She would give the grieving man the proof that one person in his vast cold house had seen the heart he thought he had buried. Tom Pell begged her not to. "He'll have you whipped, miss," the boy said, his eyes huge. "Or worse. Gentry don't take gifts from the likes of us. They take it as cheek." Mrs. Good, who had grown almost fond of the strange, quiet girl, was blunter. "You'll be out the gate by midnight," she said, "and not a reference between here and the sea." "Burn the thing, Seraphine. I'm asking you kind." But Seraphine had spent 4 months looking at the truest face she had ever painted, and she had come to believe a foolish thing, that a man who could grieve that deeply could not be wholly cold. She wrapped the portrait in the only clean cloth she owned, and on the night of the ball, while the gentry danced above, she climbed the back stair in a borrowed gray dress, slipped through a service door into the blazing gallery, and walked the length of the marble floor to lay her gift at the Duke's feet. You already know how that went. What you do not yet know is what the Duke did the morning after he knelt. He did not send for her. That was the first surprise. Seraphine had been moved, on the Dowager's furious command, from the attic cot to a guest room with a fire and a feather bed, and she lay awake all night in the unfamiliar softness, certain that dawn would bring men to drag her back down to the kitchens, or out the gate, or into a magistrate's cell for the crime of impersonating a dead princess. She did not yet believe the falcon. She did not yet believe the chin, or the grave, or any of it. She had been Seraphine Voss, the scullery girl, for 23 years, and one old woman's tears in a ballroom did not unmake a life that long. But dawn brought no men. It brought a maid with hot chocolate and a gown of soft green wool, and a message that the Dowager Duchess would receive her in the East Wing when she was ready. And it brought, slipped under her door by an unseen hand, the two torn halves of her portrait, carefully gathered, carefully stacked, the ripped edges aligned. There was a folded note on top. The hand was hard and slanting and unmistakably the Duke's. It said only, "I have spent the night looking at what I tore." 3 words were crossed out below that, scratched through so violently the pen had torn the paper, and Seraphine never did learn what they had been. She went to the East Wing. The Dowager Duchess of Aldenmore sat by a window in a room hung with portraits of dead Vossarts, and the moment Seraphine entered, the old woman pointed a ringed finger at the largest painting on the wall. It showed a young woman with auburn hair and large green eyes and a chin like the prow of a ship. "My daughter," the Dowager said. "Princess Aurelia. Painted the spring before she married beneath her station and was cut out of the succession for it." Beneath her station. The old woman laughed, a sound like dry sticks. She married a poor portrait painter, a man with nothing but a pair of clever hands and a way of seeing faces that no one could teach him. They had one child, a daughter, and the night the fever took the village and the manor burned, the midwife carried that daughter out and was never seen again. The Dowager turned her terrible bright gaze on Seraphine. "You grind your own pigment, child. You see faces no one else troubles to see. You have your father's gift in your hands and your mother's falcon at your throat. Tell me you are not Aurelia's daughter, and I will call you a liar to your face." Seraphine could not tell her so. The days that followed had the unreal quality of someone else's life. Lawyers came. Old servants of the late princess were summoned from their cottages and shown into the green drawing-room, where they wept and curtsied and swore on their souls that the girl had her mother's eyes. The Sisters of St. Bridget sent the foundling book, and there in faded ink under the date 19 years past was the entry, "Female infant, delivered by an unknown woman who died of fever within the week. A silver falcon pendant about the child's neck, name unknown, christened Seraphine for the day." The pendant was struck against the royal die in the Dowager's own jewel book. The grave on the moor was opened by a magistrate and found, as it had always secretly been, to hold no infant at all, only a wax doll wrapped in royal linen, a desperate decoy left by a midwife who knew the child was hunted. For Seraphine had not merely been lost, she had been hidden. The reason her mother fled the succession, the reason a manor burned and a doll was buried, was that the late Princess Aurelia had stood between a cousin and a crown. And that cousin, a hard, ambitious man named Lord Cassian Vossard, had wanted the line ended. He was still alive. He was, in fact, expected at Aldenmore within the fortnight, for he had spent 19 years as the unquestioned heir to the Dowager's vast estate and the dormant Vossard title, and a long-dead princess's living daughter stood, now, precisely where the wax doll had once lain, between Cassian and everything he believed was his. Through all of it, Duke Aldrich Thornvale kept his distance, and Seraphine told herself she was glad. She had not forgotten the sound the canvas made when he tore it. She had not forgotten the kitchens where it belongs. When they passed in a corridor, he inclined his head with a stiff courtesy that was almost worse than his contempt, and she returned it with a colder one, and they did not speak. The whole house watched them not speak. Lady Ophelia Marchwood, who had laughed loudest in the gallery and who had spent 2 seasons angling to become the next Duchess of Thornvale, watched hardest of all, and what she saw in the Duke's averted eyes when the new princess passed did not please her at all. It was Tom Pell, the kitchen boy, who first told Seraphine what the Duke did at night. The lad still slipped up to her rooms when no one was looking, partly from loyalty and partly because she fed him jam tarts and let him grind pigment. "He's in the long gallery every night, miss, after the candles are out," Tom whispered. "Just standing in front of the old paintings. Mrs. Good caught him at 2 in the morning and he near took her head off." Seraphine said it was no concern of hers what the Duke did with his knights. But that night she found she could not sleep, and her feet, which had always been wiser than her pride, carried her down the dark service stair to the long gallery, and there she found him. He stood before the great portrait of Princess Aurelia, his back to the door, a single candle in his hand. He did not turn, but he knew she was there. "I knew your mother," he said into the dark. It was the first thing he had said to her, of his own will, since he had called her a scullery girl. "When I was a boy. She came to court once, before the trouble. She was the only person in that whole gilded snake pit who spoke to me as though I were a person and not a future duke." His voice was rough, scraped down to something Seraphine had only ever seen in his face when he held the small glove among the roses. "She drew me, on the back of a dance card, a little sketch of a sulking boy in a velvet coat, and she gave it to me and said, 'The world will tell you to harden, Aldrich, and you will be tempted, because it is easier. Don't. The hard ones are only frightened ones who stopped admitting it.' He turned then, and the candle lit the old scar through his eyebrow and the grief he no longer bothered to hide. I kept that card for 20 years. And then I buried my wife, and I burned it, because being soft had only ever cost me everyone I loved. And then a scullery girl handed me a painting that saw straight through to the frightened boy, and I tore it in half, in front of 300 people, because I could not bear that anyone still could." Seraphine stood very still. The honest part of her wanted to forgive him on the spot, and the part of her that had walked 11 miles in the rain would not let her. "You tore my mother's gift in me," she said. "Whatever you knew of her, you tore it, and you called the place I came from a thing to be ashamed of." The Duke flinched as though she had struck him. "I know," he said. "There is nothing I can offer that mends it. I am not asking to be forgiven. I am only asking," and here the proudest man in the kingdom faltered, "to be allowed to be in the room while you decide whether I ever can be." That was the night the cold between them cracked. Not melted, cracked. The way the frost on the north windows cracks at the first true sun. In a long, slow line you can hear if the house is quiet enough. Over the following weeks they began, carefully, to be in rooms together. He showed her the kingdom's geography from the library globe and named the courts she would be expected to navigate. She set up an easel in the long gallery and began, of all things, to repaint the portrait he had destroyed, not from memory this time, but from life, with the man himself sitting before her in the morning light, holding still, for once in his life, while a woman looked at him as long as she liked. The 2 torn halves of the first portrait she kept pinned above the easel where she could see them. "Why keep the ruin," he asked her once, "when you are making it new?" Seraphine did not look up from her brush. "Because the ruin is the truer of the 2, she said. "The new one is what we are becoming. The torn one is what we are." He had no answer for that, and she watched with a painter's pleasure The exact moment the answer he didn't have rearranged his whole hard face. It was nearly 5 o'clock on a gray afternoon when the carriage of Lord Cassian Vossard rolled through the gates of Aldenmore. And if you have come this far, you already feel the cold of him coming. If a proud man brought to his knees, a torn thing made whole, and a lost girl who refuses to beg is the kind of story you'd like more of, the subscribe button keeps these coming, and it costs you nothing but a moment. Now, Cassian. He came smiling. That was the thing about Lord Cassian Vossard that the servants found most unsettling. He smiled the entire time. A wide, warm, perfectly calibrated smile. As he climbed down from his carriage and embraced the Dowager, and called Seraphine my long-lost cousin, returned to us at last. What a miracle. What a joy. He was a handsome man of 50, silver at the temples, beautifully dressed, with eyes the precise gray of dishwater. He kissed Seraphine's hand and held it half a beat too long, and in that half beat she understood, with a painter's certainty about faces, that this man had been waiting 19 years to make sure she was dead, and that her being alive had not changed his intentions in the slightest. It had only changed his timeline. You must let me make up for all those lost years, Cassian said warmly over dinner, his smile never slipping. The girl has been raised in an orphanage, scrubbing pots. She cannot possibly know how to conduct herself at court. I shall take her under my wing, a few months at my estate in the capital. Tutors, Polish, will make a princess of her yet. Around the long table, the lesser cousins murmured approval. The Dowager said nothing, but her ringed fingers tightened on the stem of her glass, and Duke Aldrich, who had spent his whole life reading the men who tried to maneuver him, set down his knife very precisely and said, "How generous." Of course, as the lady is under the protection of this house, any travel would be at her own choosing, and with her own guard. From this house. The two men looked at each other down the length of the table, and the smile and the stone took each other's measure, and neither one blinked. What Cassian did not know, what Seraphine had told no one but the Duke and the Dowager, was that she had begun to remember things, not in words, in images the way a painter remembers. A burning window, a woman's face lit orange, pressing the falcon into a swaddle, and one face above the fire that she had carried in her dreams her whole life without a name to hang it on, a smiling man with dishwater eyes, holding a torch. She had drawn that face 100 times as a child, and the nuns had told her to stop, that it frightened the little ones. She had stopped drawing it. She had never stopped seeing it. And the night Cassian Vossard arrived at Aldenmore, smiling his warm, wide smile across the dinner table, Seraphine looked at him over the candles and felt the bottom drop out of 19 years, because the man in the fire had a name now, and he was passing her the salt. She did not accuse him. She was the daughter of a woman who had outwitted this man once by burying a doll, and she had not survived an orphanage by being a fool. Instead, she did what she did best. She painted him. She asked sweetly if her newfound cousin would sit for a portrait, a gift to mark the joyous reunion. And Cassian, who could deny a long-lost princess nothing in front of witnesses, agreed with his warmest smile yet. For 3 mornings he sat in the long gallery while Seraphine worked, and she let him believe she was painting the genial uncle. She was not. She was painting the man in the fire. She built him the way she had built the Duke, layer over layer, the public smile thinning until the thing beneath it showed through. The calculation, the patience, the cold appetite of a man who would burn a manor full of people for a title and call it a tragedy at the funeral. And on the 4th morning, when the portrait was nearly done, Cassian leaned over to inspect it, and his smile finally fully slipped. "That is not how I look," he said softly. "No," Seraphine agreed, not lowering her brush. "It is how you looked. By firelight. Holding a torch." The gallery was very quiet. Cassian Vassard straightened, and the warmth ran out of his face like water out of a cracked glass, and for the first time Seraphine saw the man whole and undisguised, and she understood she had made a terrible and necessary mistake, because now he knew that she knew. "Clever girl," he murmured. "Your mother was clever too, right up until she wasn't." He smiled again, but it was a different smile now, the real one, and it was the most frightening thing Seraphine had ever seen. An orphan with a wild story and a vivid imagination. Who do you imagine a magistrate will believe? The respected heir or the scullery maid playing dress-up in a dead woman's name? He gestured at the half-finished portrait of his own true face. "Burn that," he said. "Go quietly to a convent far from here, and you may yet live to be an old woman. Stay and make accusations, and I promise you the grave they dig this time will not have a doll in it." He left for the capital that afternoon, smiling, embracing the Dowager, promising to return within the month with lawyers to settle the question of the inheritance properly for the dear girl's own protection. And Seraphine was left holding a brush and a painting of a murderer, with no proof but the testimony of her own dreaming hand, against the most powerful claimant in the realm. This was the night everything she had built threatened to come apart. The Dowager, when Seraphine told her, went gray and frightened and old in a way the ballroom triumph had never made her. "He is right that they will not believe a portrait," the old woman said. "He has 19 years of standing and a seat in the High Council. We have a falcon and a foundling book and your dreams. Cassian will tie this up in the courts until you are forgotten, and then one quiet night you will fall down a stair." For the first time, Seraphine watched the Iron Dowager despair, and she understood that no one was going to save her. Not the old woman, not the lawyers, not the lawful order of a kingdom that ran on the word of men like Cassian Vassard. So she did the thing she had always done. She used the only power she had ever had. She painted. She painted all night, and the next day, and the night after that, until her fingers cramped and the candle ends she could not break the habit of hoarding burned down to nothing. She did not paint the murderer this time. She painted the night of the fire, the whole of it. The thing her dreaming hand had been trying to show her for 19 years. The burning manor, the orange windows, the midwife with the swaddle, and high in a lit window, unmistakable, a smiling man with a torch and dishwater eyes. And in the corner of the great canvas, small but exact, she painted the one detail her child's mind had clung to and never understood: a signet ring on the torchbearer's hand, a ring with a falcon and 3 letters. A ring Cassian Vassard had worn at the dinner table and wore still. The ring of the elder Vassard line, which by every law of the realm could only pass to the head of the house upon the death of all those above him in the succession. He had no right to it while Aurelia lived. He had worn it for 19 years. He had worn it because he believed, that night by firelight, that he had ended every life that stood between him and it. The ring was the proof, not the painting, the ring. Because the realm's heralds kept a record, sealed and dated, of every signet struck and every hand it was granted to, and the Vassard elder signet had been recorded as passing to Lord Cassian 3 weeks after the fire, when, by his own public account, he had been 100 miles away and known nothing of the tragedy until a letter reached him a month later. A man 100 miles away cannot claim a ring he can only inherit by being certain the bearers are dead. The painting could not convict him. But the painting told the Dowager exactly which sealed record in the herald's vault would. They sent for it quietly. They sent for it through the Duke, whose name opened doors that an old woman's and an orphan's could not, and who rode 2 days to the Herald's College himself rather than trust the request to any hand Cassian might intercept. He came back with a sealed copy of the grant, dated and witnessed, in which Lord Cassian Vossard claimed and received the elder signet on the strength of his sworn statement that Princess Aurelia and her infant daughter had perished in the fire at Vosmiri, a fire he swore, in the same document he had learned of only by letter, weeks after. The date damned him. A man cannot mourn by post a death he has not yet been told of, and then claim a ring that only that death could grant him, unless he was the one who lit the fire that caused it. Cassian returned within the month as he had promised, with 3 lawyers and a writ to remove Seraphine to the capital for her protection. He came smiling into the great gallery of Aldenmore, where the Dowager sat in her high black chair, and the Duke stood at her right hand, and the whole household gathered along the walls. And he found, hung on the wall behind the Dowager's chair, where every soul in the room could see it, an enormous painting of a burning manor and a smiling man with a torch, and beneath it, on a velvet cushion, the sealed herald's grant, open to the page that bore his name and the date that could not be true. His smile did not slip this time. He had practiced too long for that. But Seraphine, who read faces for a living, watched the calculation behind the dishwater eyes run down every road and find them all closed, and she watched him understand, in the space of 3 breaths, that the scullery maid he had ordered burned had beaten him with a paintbrush and a date. A child's fantasy, he said to the room, his voice still warm, and a clever forgery. I'll not dignify. The grant is sealed by the herald's own die, said the Duke quietly. Forge that, and you hang for it twice over. The college has already been informed of the discrepancy. The High Council convenes in 8 days. You may explain to them, my lord, how you mourned a death by letter weeks before you claimed the ring that only that death could give you. He let the silence do the rest. Or you may not be in the kingdom in 8 days. That choice, at least, is still yours. Lord Cassian Vossard looked at the painting of himself by firelight, and at the date that hanged him, and at the orphan who had seen his true face when no court in the land had thought to look. And the most powerful claimant in the realm did the only thing left to a man whose whole life was built on a lie that had just been hung on a wall. He turned, without another word, and he walked out of Aldenmore, and his carriage was over the moor by nightfall, and within the week he was across the eastern border and beyond the reach of the council he could never now face. He was not dragged out in chains. He was not made to weep. He was simply, quietly, and completely displaced, emptied out of the title and the standing he had murdered for, by a girl who never once raised her voice. Seraphine did not gloat. She stood in the gallery after the carriage was gone and looked at the painting of the fire that had taken her mother and her name, and she felt no triumph, only a vast and aching quiet, the quiet of a wound that has finally, after 19 years, been allowed to close. The Dowager rose from her high chair, crossed the floor as she had on the night of the ball, and laid her ringed hand against the girl's cheek. Aurelia's daughter, she said. Welcome home. And this time Seraphine did weep, not from shame, never again from shame, but from the simple, unbearable relief of being, at last known. There remained the matter of the Duke. He found her that evening in the long gallery, where she stood before the finished second portrait, the one painted from life, the man holding still in the morning light. Beside it, still pinned to the easel where she had kept them all these months, hung the two torn halves of the first. Aldrich Thornvale looked at the new portrait and at the old ruin beside it, and he understood at last why she had kept the broken thing where she could see it every day. "I have rehearsed this 100 times," he said, "and I have no words that are not too small." He did not kneel this time. He had knelt once, in a ballroom, out of shock. This was something he had to do standing. "I tore your portrait to shame you," he said, "because you had seen the part of me I was most afraid of, and shaming you was easier than being seen. I have spent my whole life making the easy choice, and it cost me everyone. I am asking you not to be one more." He reached into his coat and drew out the heavy gold signet ring of Thornvale, and beside it, on his open palm, a small square of paper soft with handling. It was the dance card, the boy in the velvet coat. Princess Aurelia's 20-year-old sketch of a frightened child which he had told her, in this very gallery, he had burned the night he buried his wife. "You said you burned it," Seraphine whispered. "I told you what the hard man wished were true," Aldrich said. "I have never been able to burn the only thing your mother ever made of me. I have carried it for 20 years, and I will carry it for 20 more. And I am asking, not as a duke to a princess, not as one rank to another, but as the frightened boy your mother saw, whether you might let me spend the rest of my life proving I am better than the worst thing I ever did to you." He set the signet ring on the easel's ledge beneath the torn portrait. "I will not put this on your hand until you tell me to. It can sit there 19 years if it must. But I needed you to know that the man you painted before you ever knew my name is the man I would rather be, and that he has been standing in this room the whole time, exactly as you told 300 people he was." Seraphine looked at the torn portrait, and the new one, and the dance card, and the ring. She had walked 11 miles in the rain into this house with everything she owned in a square of oilcloth, and she had been called a scullery girl on its grandest night, and she had buried a murderer with a paintbrush, and she had been named a princess by a dying woman's daughter's mother in front of the whole proud world. And of all of it, the thing that finally undid her was a soft square of paper a hard man had refused to burn. She did not answer in words. She took up her brush. She always answered in paint, and on the torn portrait, across the rip he had made through his own painted heart, she laid one careful stroke of gold, the way a master mends a broken bowl, not by hiding the break, but by gilding it, so that the wound becomes the most beautiful part of the whole. Then she set down the brush, and she picked up the ring, and she put it on her own hand, and she looked up at the Duke of Thornvale with her mother's chin lifted and her mother's eyes shining. "The likeness was gone," she said. "But the man I painted was always still in the room. They were married in the spring, in the chapel on the moor, with Tom Pell carrying the rings, and Mrs. Good weeping in the front pew, and the Dowager Duchess standing straight as a fire iron beside the daughter of the daughter she had mourned for 19 years. The mended portrait hung in the long gallery for the rest of their lives, the gold seam catching the morning light, and visitors who did not know the story would ask why the Duke and Duchess of Thornvale kept a torn and gilded painting in the place of honor when they could have hung a flawless one. And the Duchess, who had been a scullery girl and a lost princess, and was now simply a woman who had been seen, would smile and say only this, that anyone can love a thing while it is whole, but it takes a braver heart to gild the place where it was broken, and that the people worth keeping are the ones who, when you tear them in half, kneel down and help you press the pieces back together. So I'll leave the last of it with you. the way Seraphine left her mended portrait for strangers to puzzle over. A man tore a woman in half to keep from being seen, and then he knelt. And whether that kneeling was worth her forgiveness is not for me to decide. If a proud man had wounded you the way Aldrich wounded Seraphine, and then spent everything he had to prove he was the better man underneath, would you have gilded the break and let him in? Or would you have kept the torn portrait exactly as it was, as proof of what people are, when no one is making them be kind? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely cannot decide myself. And if you stayed to the end of this one, the next story is already waiting. So subscribe, light a candle, and I will see you in the gallery.